Hi, this is Beth back with part 2 of my April 2018 Kill a Pad project share. If you happen to miss part 1, or if this is the first time watching one of my videos, I made a goal at the beginning of 2018 to try and use up at least one full 12 by 12 paper pad each month. And I am doing these project shares because as a scrapbooker, mostly what I have is 12 by 12 paper. And most of the videos I've seen out there, they show you like one individual project at a time, which is awesome. I've gotten a lot of great ideas out of those, a lot of which you will see here. Or they use a smaller pad and the focus is on cards. And so I'm trying to share some of my experiences with you guys, like all in one place. It's just kind of nice to have some of these ideas all in one place, especially if you've become a hoarder like me, have all this 12 by 12 inch paper to use, or if you're just starting out. It's a great way to learn how to use your paper and how to use up those scraps. This particular pad is one I've had for at least 5, maybe even 10 years, I'm embarrassed to say, but at one point I used to, when I got a paper pad, I would tear it down and store it by color, just because I would work on smaller projects at the time and it was easier for me to see all of my patterns by color than to see them by maker. Just to know that, oh my gosh, I need a piece of blue paper. All my blue paper's here. Now I still store my individual sheets that way, but I do my pads together. And my focus on this particular project was to make, making bookmarks. I wanted to try and use up this pad as quickly as possible because I didn't have a whole lot of time. And I make bookmarks and cards that go to a program called Cards for Soldiers, which sends handmade greeting cards to the soldiers that are based overseas and allows them to sign those cards and send them back home to their loved ones. There's a lot of soldiers that are on remote bases and don't have access to greeting cards or birthday cards, or they don't have a lot of access to verbal communication. So written communication is kind of how they operate, and then these cards just allows them a special touch, a special way to do that with their family and friends. So I said my focus was on the bookmarks. I also did make some personal 12 by 12 scrapbook pages and a mini scrapbook. And then I used most of what I could for bookmarks and then mixed it up a little bit and used the scraps that I had left over for cards. Normally my focus is on the cards and the bigger projects, and then with whatever scraps I have left over, I make the bookmarks. So this was a little backwards for me normally. Use my brain in a different way, which was good. So in order to maximize my paper, once I finished my bigger projects, I went through and pulled out all of the smaller patterns for my bookmarks, and then saved like the bigger or more solid patterns for card bases, mats for my card fronts. I took each 12 by 12 piece of paper and cut it down into 4 5 by 5 inch squares. So that would give me 4 of these corner type bookmarks. And then that also then left me with a 2 by 12 inch strip, which I cut down into 2 to make 2 of these like long skinnier bookmarks. And then it also left me with a 2 by 10 inch strip, which I thought would be perfect. If I cut it down, I could make a card mat for a card front for that very easily. So once I finished with all my bookmarks and all my other bigger projects, I settled down to use my scraps on my cards, and I started with these 2 by 10 inch strips. So I just cut it in half lengthwise and then put the 2 matching pieces as one card front. And I used these in several different ways. This was just one way that I used them, with some circle elements and then a strip going through the middle. And then I just add like a little fishtail banner for a little something extra at the bottom. This one was, I didn't have any more of these sizes left, so I used what I had. Another way to use these strips, and here on these examples, you can't even tell that they were individual strips. It looks like one solid piece that could be behind this brown patterned piece. So I took my 2 5 inch or my 2 by 5 inch strips and laid them on, put them on this card front, and then overlapped them with a solid, another almost 2 inch strip that went kind of just off center of middle, and then layered it up with a sticker that I had from my stash. This one I did the same thing, but with the thinner strip, but still it's off center. And again, it looks like it could be one solid panel behind there. You'd never know. And then this is just another example. I had more of a solid piece and I put it more in the middle. So I like backed it on white cardstock and then put it in the middle. So just another variation of those. Once I had used up all those 2 by 5 inch strips, I went through and some of the bigger patterns or more solid patterns that I had saved for my cards, I cut those down. I have a go-to card sketch that I use when I want to make a bunch of cards quickly or use up a lot of paper quickly. And this is my favorite one to use because it takes up a 4 1/8 by 5 3/8 piece of pattern paper for your card mat here. And then this is kind of a 3 by 4 1/4, I think, piece of pattern paper that goes in the middle as kind of the focal point. And I just backed that on a white cardstock mat. And then further used up scraps by just taking a simple hole punch and cutting circles out just as an added embellishment. So this one I had forgotten to mat on the white because it got stuck in with some other scraps, but I did that on all of these with some different paper. And most of the sentiments that I focused on in this pack, because a lot of them were masking, I did a lot of Father's Day and birthday. There are some thank yous and thinking of yous in here as well. I did several of these. And then this one is just a slight variation of that same sketch, but instead of putting my sentiment across here, I did 2 fishtail banners kind of opposite each other on the corners and then put my sentiment as a circle in the middle. And then this one is done kind of similar. It's just turned to landscape position. And instead of doing a sentiment across the middle, I put an image just to mix them up and give them a little more interest. And I don't have a lot of image stamps. I have tons of sentiments, but I don't have a lot of image stamps. So what I actually did here is I found this old car image on my silhouette, in my silhouette library. And just instead of cutting it out of paper, I sent it to my printer and printed it out in color, like in a dark blue that I knew matched the paper, and then just cut it out. And it looks like I stamped it on there, but I really didn't. Don't tell anybody. So that was another variation of that. And then there were some where I still had like a bunch of pieces of the larger backing, the piece, my 4 1/8 by 5 3/8 inch piece to go as my card mat, but I didn't have any more of those bigger pieces of focal point paper. So I ended up doing some that are smaller rectangles or squares, and then just put a circle sentiment kind of off center or even in the corner, and then a little banner strip. And then here is another example. Like, this is one of the few image stamps I do have. Most of my image stamps are flowers, not very manly. But since I did have some floral paper in this pack, I decided to go ahead and use this floral stamp because I thought it went well. And I had an ink that kind of matched the paper exactly. I did use some of my own brown cardstock as a mat behind this blue floral, but I did several of those. This one was a little different. Play on that as well. And then here I still had another piece of that red kind of with the cream floral, but I didn't have a lot of bigger pieces to go in the center. So in this case, I just used some cardstock, made some fishtail banners, layered them up with another red pattern that was in there. This one is actually, I thought it was very pretty paper on its own. And so in such big flowers, any sentiment I would have done on here, and this was pretty much the size that this piece was. So any sentiment I would have done here would have it didn't look right up here and would have covered up some of the flowers. So I thought this was very pretty on its own, and it will just be a note card that I will happily use. And then I had this paper, which has this beautiful like wreath-like floral element on it. And so I cut it down so that that would be my card focus on the mat for the front of my card, and just did a simple scallop circle mat with a circle sentiment in the middle, and just let the wreath-like floral element kind of be the main focus of the card. So after that, I did have a few more pieces of background matte pattern paper. And from a previous project that I had done with this paper, I had made another type of the corner bookmark, which left me with a bunch of triangular scraps. And so I was trying to figure out how in the world to use those up. And so I used those up in a couple different ways. But this was one where I just put all of the triangles together, like with their points in the middle to make it look like a diamond shape, and then just put a circle element in the middle. And then on this one, I did the same thing, but instead of a diamond, I turned it so that it's a square and then matted it on some tan cardstock with an element in the middle. So, and again, you can see that on this one, I used 2 of those 2x5 inch strips together as my background mat. And at the very end, I thought I was done and was cleaning up, and ended up finding more of these triangles, and so was out of any other coordinating cardstock or pattern paper, but had a bunch of little bitty scraps left. So this one I kind of pieced together what I could. I had the main element and then just used some of these triangles and stars at the bottom just to give it a little bit more, because I thought it looked too plain by itself. When I cut down my 12 by 12 pieces that I used for my card mat, so like on this, when I cut it down into 4 1/8 and 5 by 3/8, I was left with a lot of strips like this. So it's like 1.5 inches by 4 something, or 1.5 inches wide. And then a lot of times I would cut them down into even pieces. So this is kind of another go-to that I use when I'm using up my paper pads. From once I've cut a sheet down, I usually end up with some strips, and so I try to piece them together to go behind, as a mat for a focal point on a card. So this one, it just kind of kept it simple and put these 3 strips together, and then one of my stamped flower images, and then a sentiment up here. So also what I found, this particular paper pack had, it wasn't really a true tearaway strip, but it did have extra on the top. You can tell there was a hole in the pad so that they could hang it when it was in the store. And so I was left with, it was probably almost 1 inch thick strip at the top. And so I was like, how can I use those strips up? And so this particular card sketch, I had seen from Christy Marcotte, who is also on YouTube and has great tutorials for 6x6 paper pads. She has used this one several times before. And I just took some of those 1 inch strips and cut them down evenly. So I think this is probably about 2.5 inches, and then did a mat that was like 1/4 inch longer than what my strips were, and then just laid my strips in a pattern that I liked and kind of used that as my focal point background for this card. And again, you can see on both of these, I had those 2x5 inch strips that I pieced together, trying to use it all up. Nothing's going to go to waste. Here is another way that I used up a lot of those strips, either from the tearaway piece or just from what I had left over. I've seen several variations of this all over Pinterest, and you just kind of create your own pattern. Like I just laid paper strips in a couple different ways, and this is actually on a piece of white cardstock that I then attached to the white card front. So that made it easier because I could lay everything down and then go back and trim it all off, but I got 2 of those. So it almost looks like a little bit of a quilted look, and a great way to use up a lot of those paper strips that you have. Here was yet another way. I had so many of those paper strips from different pieces of this project. So I had a couple of strips. I think these may have been left over from, they were almost like a 2x5 inch strip. And so I had just seen this on Pinterest where they took a pattern paper strip up here, and then they did a lot of little fishtail banners at the bottom. And so I went through and pulled all of the blue and brown ones that I had left to go with this paper. I managed to get 2 of those out of there. And then I also had these left and tried to pull in the red ones. And so then this is just a strip that's glued across, so you can't tell, you know, where this paper ends and where the banners end. Again, a good way to use up all those little bitty pieces. Some of my wider pieces that I had seen this sketch around several places too, so I just cut them down because it's varying widths. It's kind of varying widths and lengths, but just matted some of these scraps onto white cardstock and then glued them together, and then wrapped my ribbon from top to bottom, and then glued a bow and a little tag on the top as well. Just looks like a stack of gifts. And at this point I was out of pattern paper to use for my background, so I just pulled some blue cardstock out of my stash and then ran it through with an embossing folder to give it a little texture. I had 1 stars and then 2 chevron. I don't know if you can see that detail, but. And one last batch that I had, where I actually had sizable amounts of paper scraps left. I just pulled in some brown cardstock from my stash and then was trying to use up some little bitty pieces. So stamped my sentiment and did a couple layers of matte, like that's stamped on blue. Did a white matte and then a red matte from some of that red pattern paper I had. Did a little fishtail banner up here, and then couple of dots that I had punched out of the paper. And last, one of the other scraps I have left from the old way of doing bookmarks, just to show you an example, when you would cut your paper into a square, fold it in half, and then you would cut 1 full square out and then half of this opposite corner on a diagonal. So you would have a square piece and a triangle piece, and I had so many of these from the last time I sent a batch of stuffed cards for soldiers. So I took a lot of those, I'd use a lot of the squares here. Let me start here. I cut down what I could here. In some cases I used 2 different pattern papers together as kind of a square element, put my circle in the middle. And I've seen this card sketch also where you do your squares, you mat it on a solid piece of cardstock, and then you have a patterned background paper. I didn't have a lot of patterned background paper left, so I just let the white card front be my matting, and then added a strip down here with a star that I had punched out of some scraps. Same thing here, I just used 2 different pattern papers. And this one I actually had several of the same. And then I did the same thing with the red. Most of these are all the same pattern, so I just made these 4 all the exact same way, just with a different sentiment on that one. But so it's basically, they're almost 2-inch squares that are put together in a square with a little bit of space to act as matting, and then added a coordinating pattern paper strip at the bottom, and then punched a star out of some cardstock. So that used up a lot of those squares. And like I said, I'd used the triangles up on an earlier one. And so I still had some squares left, and then some random paper strips. And I have made this one several times before too, with a bunch of when I have little bitty pieces that can be cut into 1-inch squares. Basically all these are 1-inch squares. And you lay one so that it's half on and half off the cardstock, you know, with your, almost like in a diamond pattern going across. And then just filled in with some more of the solid patterns just to kind of coordinate with that. And then just stamped a thinking of you sentiment at the bottom. 2 of those. And then with the blue, I happen to have a bunch of this blue and brown pattern paper. So on this one I made the blue and brown pattern paper kind of the center diamonds, and then staggered it with a a non-floral, just to kind of make it a little more less feminine, I guess. But, and in this case, I had so many of these, I just used that blue floral all across the card. But, and then this one was a bunch of random squares that I had, you know, some solid brown, some with blue dots, some with this little scroll work on it, and then some solid blue. So I kind of made, since I actually had 4 of the solid blue, I just put that in the center as my focal point, and then used the other blue and brown patterns surrounding it. So after all my cards were made, and I still had some little bitty pieces left, normally what I do is, well, then I will go in and use up those pieces and cut them into little fishtail banners and decorate the inside of my card. So I did that on all 66 of my cards. And you can see here too, if you want a fast way to use up these tear-off strips, you can just take this strip, glue it down here to the bottom of the card, and then cut off what you don't need. And it's a fun way to give the inside of the card a little bit of interest, but you know, the person who's going to send it still has plenty of room to write their own message. And again, you use up scraps, because God forbid you let any little piece of paper go to waste. But with that being said, after making 6 12 by 12 inch scrapbook pages, a 5 by 7 mini scrapbook, and over 80 bookmarks and 66 cards, I will admit I did have some scraps left. This is what I had left. So I could go in and try and embellish some of the insides of the cards a little more, or like make another pass at, you know, if any of the front of the cards need anything. But honestly, after working with a full 12 by 12 paper pad, I'm kind of done with this paper. That's usually how I am. By the time I get to this point, I'm done. My patience is done. My interest in the paper is done. So I'm still going to call it good. Like I said, I got 66 cards, over 80 bookmarks, some of my own scrapbook pages done. I have tons of cards and bookmarks that are going to be donated to Cards for Soldiers. Some cards that will replenish my personal card stash, and I used up paper out of my own stash, so freed up a little bit more space in my craft storage. So again, I'm going to call it a win, and if I have to get rid of that little bitty pile of scraps, that's still okay with me. So anyway, thank you guys for sticking with me, especially if you've made it through part 1 and 2 of this project share. I hope you guys have found some good ways to use up your little bitty scraps so that you can make the most of the paper that you have. If you have any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, if you liked my video, please give me a thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more of these in the future, because like I said, I'm going to try and do at least 1 pad kill a month to, you know, make some useful things and get rid of some of this paper that I've been hoarding. So you can subscribe and be notified of any future videos. But I thank you guys for your time, and I hope you have a great afternoon. Thanks.